The chains cut into Bjorn's wrists as Magnus raised the executioner's sword. 200 Vikings screamed for blood, his blood, the blood of a traitor who'd freed the captives and betrayed everything his people stood for. Bjorn closed his eyes, accepting death as the price of conscience. Then the horn blast shattered the moment. Ships on the horizon, English banners flying, and at their prow, impossible and alive, stood Eleanor, the captive woman he'd saved, now commanding her rescuers to save him. 3 days ago, he was a Viking warrior raiding English villages. Now he knelt condemned, watching his entire world collapse around one terrible choice: free the innocent or remain loyal to monsters. How did a man sworn to raiding become the one thing Vikings despise most? A savior of their enemies. The autumn wind carried the acrid smell of burning thatch across the Northumbrian coastline as Bjorn Eriksson wiped blood from his axe blade. At 28 winters, he had participated in 17 raids along these English shores, each one blurring into the next, like waves against stone. But today, something felt different. Something felt wrong. The village of Whitby lay in ruins behind him. Smoke billowed from cottages that had stood for generations, their wooden frames collapsing into ash and memory. The screams had finally stopped an hour ago, replaced by an eerie silence, broken only by the crash of distant waves and the occasional sob from the line of captives being herded toward the longships. Bjorn's fingers tightened around the leather-wrapped handle of his weapon as he watched his fellow warriors, men he'd fought beside since boyhood, drag villagers from their hiding places. Women clutched children. Old men bled from fresh wounds. Young boys, barely old enough to grow beards, were forced to their knees in the mud. "Bjorn!" The voice belonged to Gunnar, his childhood friend and shield brother. "Stop standing there like a Christian monk. Help me with these prisoners." Bjorn walked over, his boots squelching in blood-soaked earth. Gunnar had corralled 15 villagers near the shoreline. Fishermen, farmers, a baker still wearing his flour-dusted apron. Their faces showed the same expression Bjorn had seen countless times before: terror mixed with resignation, the look of people who knew their world had just ended. "Tie them well," Gunnar said, tossing Bjorn a coil of hemp rope. "Jarl Magnus wants them secured before nightfall. The strong ones will row, the women will serve, and the rest—" He shrugged, leaving the sentence unfinished. As Bjorn began binding wrists, he met the eyes of a young woman, perhaps 20 years old, with dark hair matted with dirt and blood. Unlike the others, she didn't look away. Her green eyes held his gaze with a defiance that surprised him. There was no begging, no tears, just a silent accusation that cut deeper than any blade. "What's your name?" Bjorn asked in the broken English he'd learned from previous raids. "Eleanor," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "Daughter of Thomas the fisherman. And yours, Viking. What name should I curse when I pray?" Bjorn felt heat rise to his face. He'd been called many things: warrior, raider, son of Eric, but never had a captive asked his name. They usually just screamed or wept. "Bjorn," he said quietly, pulling the rope tighter than necessary, suddenly angry at her composure. "Bjorn," she repeated, testing the word. "I'll remember it." The march to the ships took an hour. Jarl Magnus Bloodaxe, their chieftain, had anchored 3 longships in a protected cove, their dragon-headed prows pointing toward the grey sky like accusing fingers. Magnus stood on the shore, his massive frame wrapped in a bearskin cloak, directing the loading of plunder with the efficiency of a merchant counting coins. 83 captives, announced Thorstein, Magnus's second in command, consulting marks on a wooden tablet. 12 too old or wounded to be useful. Should we kill them? Magnus said, without looking up from the silver chalice he was examining. No point feeding useless mouths. Bjorn felt his stomach clench. He'd killed in battle, felt the hot spray of blood, heard the final gasps of dying men. That was war. That was honorable combat between warriors, but this executing unarmed elderly villagers and wounded farmers. Where was the honor in this? Something wrong, Bjorn. Magnus's eyes fixed on him, sharp and predatory. You look pale. Not sick from the crossing, are you? No, Jarl, Bjorn said quickly, lowering his gaze. Just tired from the fight. There was no fight, Magnus laughed. A few farmers with pitchforks. Your axe barely got wet. He waved dismissively. Take the prisoners to the holding area, guard them well. I don't want any escapes before we reach home. The holding area was a natural depression in the rocky coastline, surrounded by steep cliffs on 3 sides and easily guarded by 2 men. By the time they'd moved all 71 surviving captives into the space, dusk was bleeding into the horizon, painting the sky the color of old bruises. Bjorn drew the first watch, along with a young warrior named Olaf. They built a fire and settled onto rocks overlooking the prisoners, who huddled together against the cold wind coming off the North Sea. My first raid, Olaf said proudly, barely 18 and eager as a hunting dog. Did you see how I took down that blacksmith? Clean strike right through. I saw, Bjorn cut him off, not wanting to hear the boy's excitement. He stared into the fire, seeing Eleanor's green eyes in the flames, hearing her voice. I'll remember it. Why should that bother him? He'd never cared about the names or memories of captives before. They were spoils of war, nothing more. That's what his father had taught him, what every raid leader had reinforced. The English were Christians, foreign and strange in their beliefs. They weren't like true people, but as he looked at the frightened faces below, huddled together for warmth and comfort, he saw families, mothers protecting children, men shielding wives, an old woman singing softly to calm a crying infant. They looked exactly like the families in his own village when winter storms struck and everyone gathered in the longhouse. Eleanor sat apart from the main group, her back straight despite the rope binding her wrists. Even in defeat, even as a captive, she maintained her dignity. Bjorn found himself wondering about her life before today. What had she done this morning? Mended nets with her father, laughed with friends, dreamed about her future. All of that was gone now, destroyed by men like him, following orders from men like Magnus. And for what? Silver, glory. He'd heard the skalds sing of raiding as if it were noble, as if taking from the weak made you strong. But sitting here, watching the aftermath, Bjorn felt no glory. He felt only a growing weight in his chest, heavy and cold as iron. Dawn broke grey and miserable over the Northumbrian coast. Bjorn hadn't slept during his watch, his mind too tangled with unfamiliar thoughts. When Gunnar and 3 other warriors came to relieve him, he almost welcomed the distraction. Magnus wants them fed, Gunnar announced, dropping 2 sacks of hard bread and dried fish near the fire. Can't have them dying of hunger before we get them home and sell them. Sell them. The words hung in the cold morning air. Bjorn had participated in the capture of slaves before, had even helped guard them on the journey back to Scandinavia. But he'd never quite thought about what happened after. The markets, the inspections, families torn apart and sold to different buyers like livestock. You look troubled, brother, Gunnar said, studying Bjorn's face. What's wrong? Worried about your share of the silver? No, Bjorn said, just thinking. Dangerous habit. Gunnar laughed, clapping him on the shoulder. Leave thinking to the Jarl. We're warriors, not priests. As the others began distributing food to the captives, Bjorn noticed Magnus approaching from the ships, his expression dark. Behind him walked Thorstein and 2 other senior warriors. Something was wrong. Gather round, Magnus commanded. The warriors formed a loose circle around their leader. We have a problem. One of the captives tried to escape during the night. A woman. She made it about 50 yards before the guards caught her. A cold feeling settled in Bjorn's stomach. He already knew which woman before Magnus pointed her out. Elena stood between 2 warriors, her face bruised, her dress torn, but her eyes still held that same defiance. She'd tried to run. Of course she had. he would have done the same. "You know what we do to runners," Magnus said, his voice carrying across the gathered men. "It sends a message to the others, keeps them docile. Olaf, bring me my whip." "Jarl," Bjorn heard himself say before he could stop the words. "She's valuable. Unmarked slaves fetch better prices." Magnus turned slowly, his eyes narrowing. "Did I ask for your counsel, Bjorn Eriksson?" The other warriors went quiet. Challenging a Jarl's decision, even indirectly, was dangerous. Bjorn felt Gunnar tense beside him, probably already calculating how to diffuse the situation. "No, Jarl," Bjorn said carefully. "I meant no disrespect. I only thought—" "You only thought of silver," Magnus interrupted, his voice softening slightly. "That's practical, I respect that." He studied Elena, who stood straight-backed and silent, refusing to beg. "Very well. No whipping. But she needs to learn. Chain her to the rocks. No food or water today. If she survives the night, she can travel with us tomorrow." It was a mercy, by Magnus's standards. Bjorn exhaled slowly, feeling the tension drain from the circle. But as the guards dragged Elena toward the cliff face, she looked back at him. There was no gratitude in her expression, instead something like contempt, as if his small intervention had made him worse than the others somehow, as if she preferred honest brutality over false compassion. The day passed with agonizing slowness. Bjorn and 6 other warriors were assigned to continue guarding the prisoners while the rest prepared the ships for departure. The captives sat in miserable silence, occasionally glancing toward Eleanor, who remained chained to a rocky outcrop 20 feet away, exposed to the wind and cold. By late afternoon, Bjorn could see her shivering, her lips turning blue. He knew Magnus's mercy might still result in her death. Exposure killed as surely as a blade, just more slowly. When the other guards were distracted, Bjorn walked to where Elena was chained, carrying a water skin hidden under his cloak. "Drink," he said quietly, holding it to her lips. She turned her head away. "I don't want your charity, Viking." "Don't be stupid," Bjorn hissed. "You'll die of thirst." "Then I'll die free," she said, meeting his eyes. "Not a slave." "You're chained to a rock," Bjorn said. "That's not freedom." "Freedom is here." Elena touched her chest with her bound hands. "Where you can't reach it. Where your Jarl can't reach it. You can chain my body, but you can't make me grateful for water given by the same hands that destroyed my village." Bjorn felt anger flare. "I saved you from the whip." "Did you?" Elena's laugh was bitter. "Or did you just change the method of torture? You want me to thank you, to smile while you and your brothers rip everything from us?" She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I had a younger sister, Viking, 10 years old, named Mara. She loved to collect shells on the beach. Your friend Gunnar crushed her skull with his boot when she tried to run to me. So forgive me if I don't appreciate your mercy." The waterskin fell from Bjorn's numb fingers. He'd seen Gunnar kill someone during the raid. Everyone had killed, but he hadn't known it was a child, hadn't wanted to know. He'd looked away from the worst of it, telling himself that was someone else's doing, not his responsibility. "I didn't know," Bjorn said weakly. "You didn't want to know," Elena corrected. "There's a difference. You close your eyes and pretend you're just following orders, just being a good warrior. But you're here, aren't you? You swung your axe. You tied our wrists. You guard us now. The blood is on your hands too, Bjorn. All of it." He walked away without responding, his chest tight with emotions he couldn't name. Gunnar killed a 10-year-old child. His shield brother, the man he'd shared ale and stories with for 15 years, had murdered a little girl collecting shells. And Bjorn had done nothing, had been too busy fighting his own battles to notice. That night, after his guard shift ended, Bjorn couldn't sleep. He lay in his tent, listening to the wind and the distant crying from the captive enclosure. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Mara, a girl he'd never met, whose face he'd never seen, running toward her sister while Gunnar's boot came down. Around midnight, he gave up on sleep and walked back to the overlook. Below, the captives had been given thin blankets and were pressed together for warmth. But Eleanor still hung chained to the rock, alone in the darkness, trembling from cold and exhaustion. Bjorn looked around. The two guards on duty were at the far end of the enclosure, passing a drinking horn back and forth, paying little attention to their charges. Moving quietly, Bjorn climbed down to where Eleanor was chained. Her eyes opened as he approached. "Come to gloat?" "No," Bjorn said. He knelt and wrapped his own thick woolen cloak around her shoulders. "I'm sorry." Eleanor stared at him, suspicion warring with confusion on her bruised face. "Why?" "Because you're right," Bjorn said simply. "About all of it." He couldn't undo what had been done, couldn't bring back her sister or her village or her life, but he could give her this small comfort, this tiny acknowledgement that she was a person, not just plunder. "This doesn't change anything," Eleanor said, but she didn't refuse the cloak. "Tomorrow you'll still be my captor." "I know," Bjorn said. "But maybe I can be a different kind of captor." "There is no different kind," Eleanor said, closing her eyes. But Bjorn thought he detected the slightest softening in her voice, a hairline crack in her armor of hatred. As he climbed back up to his post, Bjorn realized that something inside him had broken during this raid. The simple world he'd known, where Vikings were strong and the English were weak, where might made right and glory justified everything, had shattered like thin ice. He couldn't go back to the man he'd been yesterday. That man was gone, drowned under the weight of a little girl's death and an older sister's accusations. The question now was, who would he become instead? The longships departed at dawn, their oars slicing through grey waters as the ruins of Whitby disappeared behind them. The journey back to Magnus's settlement in Norway would take 5 days with favourable winds, crossing the North Sea's cold expanse. 71 captives were distributed across the 3 vessels, packed below deck in conditions barely fit for animals. Bjorn found himself assigned to the lead ship, along with Elena and 32 other prisoners. Magnus commanded from the stern, his massive frame silhouetted against the pale sky, while warriors rotated rowing shifts every 2 hours. The captives sat chained together in the hold, given only enough movement to prevent their muscles from seizing entirely. On the second day, as Bjorn brought water to the prisoners during his off-shift, he noticed a young boy, no more than 8, burning with fever. The child's mother, a woman named Beatrice, clutched him desperately, trying to cool his forehead with seawater-dampened cloth. "Please," Beatrice begged in broken Norse when Bjorn approached. "He needs medicine, herbs, something." Bjorn knew the ship carried medicinal supplies for wounded warriors, but nothing for sick slaves. He also knew that Magnus's philosophy was simple. The weak died, the strong survived. That was the natural order. "I'll see what I can do," Bjorn found himself saying. Elena watched this exchange from her position against the hull, her expression unreadable. Since the night he'd given her his cloak, she'd spoken to him 3 times, each conversation brief and guarded, but without the raw hatred of before. It wasn't forgiveness. It was more like a temporary ceasefire between enemies who'd agreed not to kill each other for the moment. Bjorn approached Thorstein, who oversaw the medical supplies. "The boy with the fever. Do we have willow bark?" Thorstein looked up from sharpening his sword. "For a slave child, you're joking." "He might die," Bjorn said. "Then he dies," Thorstein shrugged. "One less mouth to feed. His mother will sell for the same price either way. Maybe better, no crying brat slowing her down." Bjorn felt anger coil in his chest, but he forced his voice to remain calm. The mother works harder if the child lives, keeps her compliant, hopeful. It was a manipulation, a cruel calculation that made Bjorn hate himself even as he said it. But Thorstein considered, nodded, and tossed him a small pouch of herbs. "Keep the mother working then. Magnus won't like it if she dies of grief." That night, as the ship rocked on gentle swells, Bjorn brought the medicine to Beatrice. He showed her how to brew the willow bark in hot water, how to get the child to drink it slowly. The boy's fever broke by morning, and Beatrice looked at Bjorn with tearful gratitude that felt like knives in his gut. "Thank you," she whispered. "God bless you." Bjorn turned away without responding. There was no blessing in what he'd done, just a tiny postponement of suffering. The child would still be sold, still spend his life in bondage, but at least he'd live, for whatever that was worth. "You're confusing them," Elena said later, when Bjorn sat nearby eating his ration of salted fish. "Showing kindness one moment, guarding them the next. They don't know whether to fear you or trust you." "I don't know either," Bjorn admitted. He looked at her carefully. The bruises on her face were fading to yellow and green. Someone had given her a cleaner dress, probably to increase her value at market. "How do you keep going, after everything that's happened?" Elena was quiet for a long moment, watching the other captives huddled in the semi-darkness. "My sister," she finally said. "Mara. She believed people were basically good. Even when things were hard, even when traders cheated my father or storms destroyed our nets, she'd say, 'Tomorrow will be better.' She had this impossible hope." "And you?" Bjorn asked. "I was always more practical," Elena said with a sad smile. "I saw the world for what it was, hard and unfair and cruel. I used to argue with her about it, tell her she was naive." She paused, her voice catching slightly. "Now she's gone, and I'm the only one left who remembers her hope. So I keep it alive. I stay strong because she can't anymore. Because someone has to remember that tomorrow could be better, even if it probably won't be." Bjorn felt something shift in his chest, admiration mixed with shame. Here was a woman who'd lost everything, chained in the hold of her enemy's ship, and she was stronger than he'd ever been. Stronger than most warriors he knew. "I'm sorry," he said again, "for all of it. For your sister, your village, your life. I know it means nothing, but I'm sorry." "It means something," Elena said softly. "Not much, but something. Most Vikings wouldn't bother apologizing. Wouldn't even think of us as people worth apologizing to." On the fourth day of the voyage, storm clouds gathered on the horizon. Magnus ordered the ships to make for the Norwegian coast, seeking shelter in a natural harbour near the settlement of Haugesund. They spent the night anchored in calm waters, while rain hammered the deck and wind howled through the rigging. Bjorn was on watch in the hold, ensuring none of the prisoners attempted anything desperate during the chaos of the storm. Most huddled miserably, seasick and terrified. But Elena sat calmly, her eyes distant, seemingly unafraid of the tempest. "Don't storms frighten you?" Bjorn asked. "Why should they?" Elena said. "The worst has already happened. Death would be a mercy compared to slavery." "Don't say that," Bjorn said sharply, surprising himself with his vehemence. "Don't give up." "Why do you care?" Elena challenged. "I'm your enemy, your prisoner, your prophet. What does it matter to you whether I live or die?" Bjorn didn't have a good answer. All he knew was that the thought of Elena giving up, of that iron spirit breaking, filled him with something close to panic. She'd become a fixed point in his collapsing world. Proof that dignity could survive brutality, that hope could persist in darkness. "Because you're better than us," he said finally. "Better than me, and if you break, then there's no redemption possible, for any of us." Elena studied his face in the dim lantern light, seeing something there that made her expression soften fractionally. "You really mean that?" "Yes," Bjorn said. "I do." The storm passed by morning, leaving clear skies and favorable winds. They reached Magnus's settlement by noon the next day, a sprawling collection of longhouses and workshops built around a protected fjord. As the ships glided toward the docks, Bjorn saw the entire village turning out to greet them, excited to see what plunder and slaves the raid had yielded. Magnus stood at the prow, arms raised in victory. 5 days of successful raiding," he bellowed. "Silver furs and strong backs to serve us through winter." The warriors cheered, the villagers cheered, even some of the children danced with excitement. But Bjorn felt only dread as he looked at the captives being herded onto the dock, Eleanor among them, her face carefully blank, revealing nothing. That evening, Magnus held a feast in the longhouse to celebrate the successful raid. Ale flowed freely, meat roasted over fires, and the skald sang songs of Viking valor and English cowardice. Bjorn sat with his fellow warriors, laughing at the appropriate moments, accepting congratulations on his 15th successful raid. But when Magnus stood to make an announcement, Bjorn's blood ran cold. "Tomorrow morning," the Jarl declared, his voice carrying over the crowd, "we begin the executions. The old, the weak, the defiant. They serve no purpose except as examples. We'll show these English dogs what happens when they resist Viking steel. The rest will be broken, trained, and sold. This is our way. This is our strength." The hall erupted in cheers and pounding fists on tables, but Bjorn sat frozen, his mind racing. Executions. Elena would be among them. She'd tried to escape, shown defiance from the beginning. Magnus would make an example of her specifically, probably in the most brutal way possible. Across the hall, Gunnar caught Bjorn's eye and raised his drinking horn in salute. The same Gunnar who'd killed Mara, the same Gunnar who saw nothing wrong with any of this. And suddenly, Bjorn knew with absolute clarity that he couldn't be part of this anymore. Not the raids, not the slavery, not the casual brutality that his people called honor. He would have to act, tonight. Even if it meant betraying everything he'd been taught, everyone he'd known. Even if it meant becoming an outcast from the only life he'd ever understood. Because Elena was right. There was no different kind of captor. You were either a good man or you weren't. And Bjorn had been running from that choice for too long. The settlement slept under a blanket of stars, the feast's revelry finally exhausted around midnight. Bjorn lay in his small dwelling, a timber structure he'd built 3 years ago with his share of raid profits. But sleep was impossible. His mind churned with plans, each more desperate than the last. The captives were being held in a reinforced barn at the eastern edge of the settlement, guarded by 4 warriors rotating in 2-hour shifts. The barn had been built specifically for housing slaves during the selection and sale process, with thick walls and a single barred entrance. Breaking them out would be nearly impossible, and even if he succeeded, where would they go? The nearest English-friendly territory was weeks of travel through hostile Scandinavian lands. But Magnus's announcement changed everything. Tomorrow, Elena would die. Along with anyone else the Jarl deemed too troublesome or unprofitable. Bjorn couldn't save all 71 captives, but maybe, just maybe, he could save a few. Around 2 in the morning, he rose and dressed in dark clothing. He'd cached supplies over the past day whenever possible: dried meat, water skins, a spare knife, rope. Not much, but enough for a desperate escape attempt. He knew Magnus kept the keys to the barn in his personal dwelling, attached to his belt even while he slept. Getting those keys was suicide, so Bjorn would have to improvise. He crept through the settlement, moving between shadows, every sense alert for patrols. The 2 guards at the barn entrance were Thor Olafsson and Eric Redhair, both competent warriors, both men Bjorn had shared countless raids with. Neither deserved what he was about to do, but he saw no other choice. "Bjorn!" Thor squinted as Bjorn approached from the darkness. "What are you doing here? Your watch isn't until dawn." "Couldn't sleep," Bjorn said casually, holding up a drinking horn he'd brought as a prop. "Thought we might share some ale, celebrate our success properly." Eric grinned. "I knew I liked you. Guard duty's boring as shit. Come on, then." Bjorn sat with them by their small fire, passing the horn around, telling exaggerated stories from the raid. He waited until both men were relaxed, laughing, their guards down. Then he struck. The pommel of his knife caught Thor behind the ear, dropping him instantly. Eric barely had time to register surprise before Bjorn's fist connected with his temple. Both warriors crumpled, unconscious, but alive. Bjorn felt a wave of relief. He hadn't wanted to kill them, but he couldn't risk them raising an alarm either. Working quickly, he bound and gagged both men, dragging them into the darkness beyond the firelight. Then he examined the barn door. The lock was massive iron, impossible to break quietly, but the hinges were older, wooden pegs held in place by leather straps. Not ideal, but workable. It took 10 agonizing minutes to work the door free enough to create a gap. Bjorn squeezed through, finding himself in the barn's dim interior, lit only by a single oil lamp. The stench hit him immediately: unwashed bodies, fear, and human waste. The captives huddled on straw-covered floors, many sleeping fitfully, others staring at nothing with dead eyes. "Who's there?" a voice called in English. An older man, one of the fishermen from Whitby. "Friend," Bjorn said quietly in English. "Need go. Now. Quiet." He spotted Elena near the back, her eyes wide with disbelief as she recognized him. Bjorn moved quickly to her side, cutting the rope binding her wrists. "What are you doing?" Elena whispered urgently. "This is insane." "They'll kill you." "Probably," Bjorn agreed. He looked around at the other captives, now stirring, sensing something was happening. "I can take maybe 10 people. Small group moves faster. Rest." He couldn't finish that sentence. The rest would die tomorrow, and he couldn't save them. Elena seemed to understand immediately. "Children first," she said firmly, "and their mothers, if possible. They have the best chance of rebuilding lives." Bjorn nodded, grateful she could make these impossible choices while he fumbled in moral darkness. Together they quickly selected their group: Beatrice and her young son Thomas, 2 other women named Mary and Judith, with daughters aged 6 and 9, an elderly woman named Margaret, who was too frail for tomorrow's executions anyway, and 3 teenage boys strong enough to keep pace. "Listen carefully," Bjorn said in English, gathering them close. "We go north to mountains, 3 days' walk. I know cave hidden. We wait there, then travel west to Scottish lands. English King Alfred controls some territories. We'll take refugees." "Why are you doing this?" Mary asked, her daughter clinging to her skirts. "Why help us?" "Because I should have helped before," Bjorn said simply. "I was wrong. My people are wrong. I can't fix that, but I can do this." They slipped out through the damaged door one by one, moving with agonizing slowness to avoid noise. Bjorn led them away from the settlement into the forest that climbed the steep hillsides above the fjord. He knew these paths from hunting trips, knew where to find game trails that would hide their tracks. They'd made perhaps half a mile when a horn blast shattered the night silence. Someone had discovered the unconscious guards. "Run!" Bjorn commanded. "Don't stop! Don't look back!" The forest erupted with shouts and torchlight behind them. Magnus's warriors were mobilizing with terrifying speed. These were men trained for raids and battles, not easily outmaneuvered. Bjorn pushed his small group harder, helping the elderly Margaret when she stumbled, carrying young Thomas when the boy's legs gave out. They'd reached the tree line when Bjorn heard a familiar voice calling his name. "Bjorn! Bjorn Eriksson, you traitorous dog!" Gunnar, his shield brother, his childhood friend, now his pursuer. "Keep going," Bjorn told Elena. "Follow this trail upward. There's a stream at the top. Follow it north. I'll catch up." "You're lying," Elena said flatly. "You're going to fight them. Slow them down so we can escape." "Yes," Bjorn admitted. "Now go." For a moment, Elena just stared at him. Then, incredibly, she rose on her toes and kissed his cheek, brief, chaste, but filled with meaning. "Thank you," she whispered, "for remembering you're human." Then she was gone, shepherding the others up the dark trail, and Bjorn turned to face the torches racing toward him through the trees. Gunnar emerged first, sword drawn, his face twisted with fury. "You spit on everything we are, everything your father taught you." "My father taught me honor," Bjorn said, drawing his own blade, "but there's no honor in what we've become." "Honor?" Gunnar laughed bitterly. "You chose them over us. English peasants over your own people." That's not honor. That's betrayal. 5 more warriors spread out behind Gunnar, surrounding Bjorn. He recognized them all. Olaf, still young and eager. Harald Greybeard, who'd fought beside Bjorn's father. Finn and Dag, twin brothers from the southern settlements, good men by Viking standards, loyal warriors. And Bjorn would have to fight them all. "I don't want to kill you," Bjorn said, addressing all of them. "But I won't let you take them back. They've suffered enough." "Then you'll die here," Gunnar said. "But know this, brother, I'll find your English whore and make her watch Magnus flay you alive. That's the mercy you've earned." Something snapped inside Bjorn at those words. The last thread of connection to his old life severed like a cut rope. He didn't feel anger, just a strange clarity. This was who Gunnar really was, who they all were, and Bjorn was done being one of them. The fight was brutal and short. Bjorn was skilled, but 6 against 1 was mathematics even valor couldn't overcome. He managed to wound Olaf, drive back Harald, even disarm Finn before Dag's spear caught him in the side. Pain exploded through his ribs as he fell, his sword spinning away into darkness. Gunnar loomed over him, blade raised for the killing stroke. "Any last words, traitor?" Bjorn coughed blood, managing a grim smile. "Tell Magnus he should have killed me years ago. I was always too soft for raiding." The blade descended and stopped inches from Bjorn's throat. "No!" Magnus's voice boomed through the forest. The Jarl himself had arrived, his bearskin cloak making him look like some ancient beast. "Don't make him a martyr. I want him alive. I want every warrior in Scandinavia to see what happens to those who betray their own kind." They dragged Bjorn back to the settlement, leaving a trail of blood through the frost-covered grass. The last thing he saw before consciousness left him was the dark forest, where Elena and the others had disappeared, free at last. He'd saved 10 people, 10 lives against hundreds of deaths, against 17 raids worth of suffering. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was something. And for the first time in his life, Bjorn Eriksson felt genuinely at peace. 3 days passed in a haze of pain. Bjorn woke to find himself chained in the same barn where the captives had been kept, his wound crudely bandaged to keep him alive for Magnus's justice. The settlement's healer, a sharp-eyed woman named Astrid, changed his dressings twice daily, her face carefully neutral. "You're healing well," she said on the 3rd morning, her voice low. "Strong constitution. You'll live long enough for what's coming." "What is coming?" Bjorn asked, though he could guess. "Public execution," Astrid said. "Tomorrow at dawn. Magnus has invited neighboring Jarls to witness it. He wants to make an example that will echo through every Viking settlement from here to Iceland." Bjorn nodded slowly. He'd expected nothing less. Betraying your clan, freeing valuable slaves, attacking fellow warriors, these crimes demanded the harshest punishment. At least it would be over soon. "Did they catch any of them?" he asked, trying to keep his voice casual. "The escaped captives?" Astrid glanced toward the barn door, ensuring they were alone. "No," she said quietly. "Search parties went out immediately, but your people covered their tracks well. It's as if they vanished into the mountains." Relief flooded through Bjorn, so intense it made him dizzy. They'd made it, Elena, the children, all of them, free and moving towards safety. His death would have meaning. "Thank you," he whispered. Astrid studied him, with an expression he couldn't quite read. "I had a sister once," she said softly. 15 years ago, Irish girl taken in a raid, beautiful and strong like your English woman. The man who bought her worked her to death in 2 years. Her voice hardened. "So yes, I'm glad they escaped. I'm glad someone finally had the courage to do what should have been done long ago." She left before Bjorn could respond, but her words stayed with him. How many Vikings harbored secret doubts about their way of life? How many Astrids were there, silently watching, silently disapproving, but too afraid or too ingrained in their culture to speak out? That night, Gunnar visited. His former friend stood in the barn doorway, torchlight casting harsh shadows across his face. For a long moment, neither man spoke. "I never understood you," Gunnar finally said. "Even as children, you were different, soft, always questioning, always thinking too much. I thought raiding would harden you, make you truly one of us." "It did the opposite," Bjorn said. "It showed me what we really are." "And what's that?" Gunnar challenged. "Predators," Bjorn said. "No different from wolves tearing apart sheep. We tell ourselves stories about honor and glory, about the weakness of Christians and the strength of our gods. But in truth, we're just men who take what we want because we can. There's no honor in that. There never was." Gunnar's hand moved to his sword hilt. "You dare! Kill me if you want," Bjorn interrupted. "Magnus is going to do it tomorrow anyway. But you came here for a reason, Gunnar. To convince yourself I'm wrong. To hear me recant, maybe, so you can sleep at night. But I won't give you that comfort." For a moment, Gunnar looked genuinely conflicted, emotions warring across his face. Then his expression hardened again, the mask sliding back into place. "I did come to tell you something," he said. "Your father would be ashamed." "My father was a raider for 30 years, Bjorn said. "He died drowning in a storm off the coast of Ireland, weighted down with stolen silver. His last words were regret that he wouldn't see home again. Not regret for the lives he'd destroyed, not sorrow for the people he'd enslaved, just sadness for himself." Bjorn met Gunnar's eyes. "If my father would be ashamed of me, then I've finally done something right." Gunnar left without another word, and Bjorn was alone with his thoughts and his approaching death. He found himself thinking about Elena, wondering if she'd made it to safety. He pictured her in some Scottish village, perhaps working as a healer or seamstress, slowly rebuilding a life from ruins. Did she think of him? Would she remember his name, or would he fade into the general horror of her capture, just another Viking face? He hoped she'd forget, hoped she'd find happiness somehow, find a way to honor her sister's impossible optimism about better tomorrows. Dawn came cold and clear. Warriors entered the barn and unlocked Bjorn's chains, dragging him into the settlement's central square, where a wooden platform had been erected. Magnus stood at its center, resplendent in his finest armor and furs, surrounded by visiting jarls and their retinues. At least 200 people had gathered to witness the execution. They forced Bjorn to his knees on the platform. Magnus's voice rang out, detailing his crimes: betrayal, theft, assault on fellow warriors, freeing valuable property. Each accusation was met with jeers and angry shouts from the crowd. "Bjorn Eriksson," Magnus concluded, drawing his sword, "you have betrayed your people, your heritage, and your gods. For this, you will die. But first, does the condemned have final words?" Bjorn looked out at the sea of faces, warriors he'd fought beside, women he'd known since childhood, children being taught what happened to traitors. He saw Gunnar standing at the front, his expression carefully blank. He saw Astrid near the back, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I do," Bjorn said, his voice carrying across the sudden silence. "I spent 28 years believing we were heroes, that our strength made us righteous, that our victories proved the gods favored us. I watched villages burn and told myself it was natural order, the strong take from the weak. That's how the world works." He paused, gathering his thoughts. This would be his only chance to plant seeds of doubt, to maybe, just maybe, make a few people question their path. But I was wrong. Strength without mercy isn't honor. Victory without justice isn't glory. We aren't heroes. We're just men who've chosen cruelty over compassion, greed over growth. Every raid makes us smaller, not larger. Every life we destroy diminishes us. The English aren't weak because they show mercy. We're weak because we've forgotten how. Angry murmurs rippled through the crowd, but Magnus let him continue, perhaps amused by what he saw as a coward's final bleating. "I freed 10 captives," Bjorn said. 10 people who will live free because I finally found the courage to do what was right instead of what was easy. That's worth my life. That's worth everything." He looked directly at Gunnar. "And I pray to whatever gods might listen, that some of you will remember this moment. That when you're in your longships, headed toward another defenseless village, some small voice will whisper, 'What if Bjorn was right?'" "Enough," Magnus said, raising his sword. "Your words change nothing, traitor. Prepare to meet whatever gods will have you." Bjorn closed his eyes, thinking of Elena one last time, hoping she'd found peace, hoping his death would mean something. The sword never fell. A horn blast shattered the morning, not the settlement's horn, but something else. Something foreign. Shouts erupted from the watchtowers as warriors pointed toward the fjord entrance. Ships, 3 of them. But not Viking longships. These were different, broader, with different rigging, and flying the banners of King Alfred of Wessex. The crowd erupted in chaos. Warriors ran for weapons. Women herded children toward safety. Visiting jarls shouted orders to their men. Magnus stood frozen on the platform, his sword still raised, staring at the approaching vessels with an expression of disbelief. Bjorn understood immediately. Elena. She'd reached Alfred's territories, told them about Magnus's settlement, about the raids and the slaves. The English king was sending a message: your victims can strike back. A figure stood at the prow of the lead ship. Even from this distance, Bjorn recognized her, Eleanor, her dark hair streaming in the wind, pointing toward the settlement. She'd led them here. She'd come back. Not for revenge, for rescue. The English ships didn't attack. Instead, they anchored just outside the harbor, their mere presence a threat Magnus couldn't ignore. If he executed Bjorn now, he'd be doing it in front of English witnesses who would report it to Alfred. The political implications would be devastating. Alfred might use it as justification for retaliatory raids, for ending the fragile trade agreements that kept Scandinavian settlements supplied during harsh winters. Magnus's sword lowered slowly. When he spoke, his voice shook with barely controlled rage. "It seems your English whore has powerful friends. You live, Bjorn Eriksson, but you are banished, exiled from every Viking settlement from here to Greenland. Your name will be struck from our histories. Your family will be shamed, and if any of my people see you again, they have permission to kill you on sight." It was both mercy and punishment. Bjorn would live, but as a ghost, a man without country or clan or identity. In some ways, it was worse than death. Warriors cut his bonds and shoved him toward the shore. Bjorn stumbled down to the water's edge, where a small boat was being launched from Elena's ship. She sat in it herself, rowing with determined strokes, her eyes never leaving his face. When the boat reached shallow water, she stepped out, wading the last few feet to where Bjorn stood in disbelief. "You came back," he said stupidly. "You freed us," Eleanor said simply. "Did you think I'd abandon you to die?" She gestured to the ships behind her. "When we reached Alfred's scouts, I told them about Magnus's settlement, about the raids, about the slaves still held here. The king saw an opportunity, a chance to recover his people and demonstrate that England isn't defenseless. But I made them agree to one condition: they had to save you too." Bjorn looked back at the settlement, at Magnus standing on the platform with murder in his eyes, at Gunnar and the other warriors watching this impossible rescue. He saw Astrid at the edge of the crowd, her hand raised in a subtle gesture of farewell. "I can never go back," Bjorn said. "No," Eleanor agreed. "But you can go forward. We can go forward, together if you want." She extended her hand. It was small and calloused from a lifetime of hard work, scarred from her time in captivity. It was the most beautiful thing Bjorn had ever seen. He took it. As they rowed back to the English ships, Bjorn didn't look back at his former life. There was nothing there worth preserving. Instead, he looked ahead, toward the vessels flying Alfred's banner, toward a future he couldn't yet imagine but was willing to discover. He'd been a Viking warrior for 28 years. He'd raided 17 villages, taken countless lives, participated in brutality he could never fully atone for. But maybe, just maybe, he could spend the rest of his days trying. "What will we do?" he asked Elena as they neared the ships. "Where will we go?" Elena smiled, and for the first time it reached her eyes. "Tomorrow will be better," she said, echoing her sister's impossible optimism. That's what Mara would say, and today I choose to believe her. Bjorn squeezed her hand, feeling something like hope bloom in his chest for the first time in longer than he could remember. He'd lost everything, his home, his name, his identity. But he'd gained something infinitely more valuable, a chance at redemption, a path toward becoming the man he should have been all along. As the English ships turned toward open water, carrying them away from his past and toward an uncertain future, Bjorn Eriksson began the long journey of learning what it meant to be truly human.